So we'll just wait a minute or two for everyone to join. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final webinar on disarmament amid US-Russia-China tensions and the prospect of a new Cold War. My name is Rhys Bowden, and I am a project assistant at Scrap Weapons and an international diplomacy student at the School of Oriental and African Studies. This series has provided a space for critical discussions on US-Russia-China relations and the potential for an arms race. Today's webinar will explore the future of US-Russia-China relations and the prospects for disarmament in the current crisis. Today, we are honoured to be joined by three highly distinguished speakers: Dr. Winnie King, Dr. Tong Zhao, and Antara Singh. Just before we start, I will run through a little housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and will be published on the Scrap YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Once the speakers have given their presentations, we will open up the floor for an audience Q&A session. Please add your questions via the Q&A function. If possible, it would be great to have your name and affiliation, and you can start leaving questions there right away. I will now hand over to my colleague Jack to introduce himself and Scrap Weapons.
Thanks, Rhys. Hello, everyone. My name is Jack Cinnamon, former postgrad at SOAS University and current project assistant at Scrap Weapons and researcher at Corruption Tracker. So Scrap Weapons aims to reframe the debate around disarmament and to challenge the dominant strategic culture of production, trade, and supply of weapons that inevitably fosters new wars and which has a direct impact on safety and development conditions of critical areas of the global south. The threat of global war looms, yet there is no practical strategy for weapons control. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and use of nuclear threats have horrified the world and emphasized the risks inherent to proliferation of conventional arms and nuclear weapons. Before this, the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that governments have failed to invest sufficiently in public health infrastructure while prioritizing spending on military modernization, procurement, and operations. In these unprecedented times, we appeal to states and others to harness their capabilities to achieve collective security through cooperative international agreements by reinvigorating efforts to achieve sustainable, verified, and irreversible disarmament. We call on states, including our governments and their representatives, to support the activation of a fourth special session on disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly. You can read more about our call and the Scrap Weapons Conference in September 2022, which will seek to build a constituency working towards the implementation of a fourth special session. The link will be posted in the chat. We invite everyone, as well as your partner organizations, to support this initiative by signing our call for a fourth special session on disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly, using the form also provided in the chat.
Thanks, Jack. So, without further ado, I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Winnie King. Dr. King is a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. She is a specialist in Chinese international political economy and international relations, with specific reference to monetary and financial reform, and in particular currency internationalization and Greater China economic regionalization. She also works extensively on Sino-UK policy as part of her work on Sino-EU relations, and has worked with and advised both government and industry actors, including the Standard Chartered Bank, Deutsche Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Central Bank of China, UK Cabinet Office, as well as the MOD and the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Reese. So I want to thank you for the invitation. And I've joined some of the seminars and webinars that preceded today, and I'm honored to be part of the series today. I think the kind of discussions that have been going on offer real insight and underscore the importance and value of organizations like SCRAP, particularly given the current circumstances in the Ukraine. The leading role of the US and Europe that they've taken in this. And so basically for me, in our focus with regards to the future of China-US tensions in the 21st century, discussion of the potential of a new arms race and what it means for international disarmament goals, it's timely. And for watchers of Sino-US relations, it's an important and inevitable discussion. With regard to the possibility of a new Cold War, my focus will basically be on what shape it will take in the future. So as Reese pointed out, I'm not a specialist with regards to international disarmament in the military sector. I'm a political economist. And so my expertise with regards to security, which I do have, mainly focuses on non-traditional security perspective with regards to international relations. So without ado, so just let me get into it. Is the key question that I think we need to define is what we mean by a new arms race. Okay, so traditionally we're talking about, within a traditional contour, talking about a competition between nations for superiority in the development and accumulation of weapons. So if we follow from that definition, China's already lost the race, right? We know with regards to nuclear weapons, Russia has over 6,000, America 5,500, China 350, right? With regards to military budgets, the United States far outspends what China has. The 2022 budget for America is 750 billion. China's 237 billion. In terms of capability, in terms of capacity, China has lost that race, okay? We also need to take into account the fact that China's never entered into a major military confrontation on the scales that we have seen with regards to Russia and the Ukraine, and what we're talking about in terms of the People's Republic of China. So with regards to experience in combat, China's record is essentially nowhere near what we see with regards to the US, its main allies in Europe, or NATO. I think what we're talking about with regards to a new arms race, what we need to really understand is that China's potential impact, reach, and capacity as an arms race is not exhaustive in terms of just looking at traditional military assets and capabilities. This is where non-traditional instruments and tools are actually quite valuable. With regards to what we see happening with regards to Russia and the Ukraine, obviously sanctions, traditional economic sanctions, have been the dominant order of the day that we've seen being applied by the Western governments and Western economies. Commercial and financial penalties, targeting specific governments, groups, individuals, seizing of assets, mainly with a direct aim of trying to punish or influence or compel certain types of behaviors. Ultimately, from China's perspective, it's the extraterritorial sanctions that the Americans are threatening that are a particular concern, right? But when we're talking about China's potential impact, reach, and capacity within Sino-US relations, ultimately the key aspect that we're seeing as a product of the sanctions on Russia is that of isolationism and expulsion. Right. So with regards to financial institutions, if we're looking at China being the second largest economy, expelling China from financial institutions and organizations like they've done with Russia and Iran with regards to SWIFT, restricting banks, bank transactions, seizure of assets with regards to private citizens, the exit of corporations for foreign direct investment, expulsion from cultural sports organizations, and that kind of thing. From a clearly national or citizenship basis, calls for the expelling of citizens by government elites, as we've seen with regards to Russia. These are obviously things that can be applied to China. The key thing, however, is that we can see how it's played out with regards to Ukraine and Russia. Obviously, it's still early days. It's only been just under a month. But China's capacity for filling certain requisite economic and institutional voids created by the sanctions that Russia's been experiencing actually has lessened the brunt to a certain extent. There's certain things that come about as illustration of the strength of sanctions by the Americans and by the West. There's clear indications that America has lost some of its grip on smaller states and weaker powers, such as Mexico, given Mexico's refusal to follow suit and impose sanctions on Russia. There's also seeming growing cracks in America's key diplomatic allies and relations. If we see with regards to how the Saudi Arabia, UAE, India have also not followed suit with regards to what America wants in terms of trying to punish Russia. With regards to the strength of non-traditional kind of weapons of mass destruction, if you want to call it, because the international economy is inherently intertwined and interdependent. Anything you do to China will have massive spillover effects for the international economy, right? One key problem that we have is the area of sanctions as a tool of persuasion applied by Western governments have had problems in compelling other states to follow suit and follow the lead of Western governments. And one key reason behind that has to do with the implication and the reputational legacy left behind with regards to COVID. So an example would be with regards to COVID diplomacy, the fact that a lot of Western governments were seen as being unfair and uneven in their policies with regards to COVID vaccination and COVID vaccination diplomacy. The West has suffered significantly with regards to international accusations of hoarding, of using the pandemic as a diplomatic tool. On the flip side, what we have is that China is seen as quite generous, particularly towards the global south, with 1.3 billion doses of vaccines being donated to 115 countries, right? So the key thing behind this is that we can see that while the impact of more non-traditional WMDs and how they would impact China's position is much stronger than we would see with regards to Russia, right? It is key to remember that with regards to the trade tariffs that were imposed under Donald Trump, the technological restrictions that were placed on China, in many instances, China was able to overcome these. It's a country of 1.4 billion consumers, right? So with regards to how a new arms race would impact China and the prospects for a new Cold War, what we're seeing with regards to Ukraine and Russia is that China is clearly seeing America's playbook. Right, every kind of tool that America and the West has in their toolbox is being used. China and other powers are seeing the potential value of diversifying their holdings with regards to debt, currency, institutional agreements, and China is being viewed as an alternative to current neoliberal multilateral institutions. So leadership becomes a really key thing in terms of when we talk about a new arms race or the idea of a new Cold War, is if we see growing fissures or growing cracks within American leadership or even a Western united front, it becomes clear that the idea of American-China tensions could escalate, okay? The escalation, however, depends on three different models. I'm very aware of my time. So whether or not how the U.S. responds to the results of if non-traditional sanctions, if non-traditional tools are used against China, how the external world and international economy responds, the extent to which regional actors respond, all of these things have a role to play, okay? But ultimately, what we're trying to understand is that there are certain things that come into play that can also influence the extent to which there is either the escalation of a Cold War into a hot war, or whether or not there is a way to kind of temper any kind of tensions that might be arising between China and the US. It ultimately depends upon the extent to which China is willing to be more independent, which is a dramatic shift away from what it traditionally wants, because it's quite happy being within the neoliberal system and being a player within it. It's been very successful and contributed to its growth. So that's a saving grace, okay? But ultimately, this is dependent upon the limitations and the restraints of both China and the United States. The key thing that we really need to understand is that the United States has been very open in expressing its interest in targeting China domestically. So be that in the form of targeting issues of separatism with regards to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang, whether or not, and really kind of taking a jab at China's international territorial integrity, whether it's going to target its economic stability. All of these things are central to party-state legitimacy and have the potential for fomenting domestic unrest and crises of confidence within China. Now, we have to remember that China's never experienced a significant recession. The 2008 global financial crisis hit it differently than it did the other major economies because of the composition of its economy. And so the extent to which how China comes out of it is still an unknown. Okay. I think lastly, what we need to understand is that China's capacity to act independently and buffer against the impact and the brunt of sanctions, or buffer against the actions and decisions of Western powers, is inherent within its own tendency to plan and to prepare. It doesn't like to be surprised. And so it has a lot of different plans in its pocket to try and respond to different things that might come up from the West. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that very informative and interesting talk. And it was very interesting to hear you make the contrast at the beginning of the speech between the military arsenals of China compared to Russia and the US, and where you were suggesting that if there is a new arms race, then China is far behind and has indeed actually already lost that race. So I think that's a very interesting perspective. And no doubt there'll be lots of questions about elements of your speech later on. So I'll now turn to Jack, who will introduce our second speaker.
Thanks, Reese. So I am delighted to introduce Dr. Tong Zhao, who is a senior fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Based in Beijing, he conducts research on strategic security issues such as nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, missile defense, hypersonic weapons, and China's security and foreign policy.
Well, thank you so much. I think one important recent development behind China's nuclear program is that we used to believe that China has been modernizing and building up its nuclear forces because China worries about the potential threats from American missile defense or conventional precision strike weapons, these technical level threats. But I think in recent years, especially after the current Chinese paramount leader came into power, he clearly is attaching to nuclear weapons a greater degree of political importance. After coming into power, he quickly upgraded the second artillery from a military branch to the PLA Rocket Force, a full military service. He clearly instructed the PLA Rocket Force to expedite the nuclear modernization process. He inspected the Chinese naval base and called on the naval officials to massively develop China's sea-based nuclear deterrent capability. As recently as last year, he basically instructed the entire PLA to accelerate the construction of high-level strategic deterrent capabilities. The reason that he appears to be taking a different path compared with his predecessors is that he seems to believe that the Western countries are increasingly unwilling to live peacefully together with China under China's current political system. The U.S. and its allies in the West, they want to destabilize China's political system. They, use, from the Chinese perspective, the Western countries, they made up excuses to demonize China. They criticize China's human rights, domestic, suppression issues. All those are just, a demonization that has no facts on the ground to back up the real intent behind such demonization is really to slow down China's growth and even to threaten China's political system to hopefully achieve regime change, right? So because of this perceived threat at the political level, the perceived aggressiveness from Western countries to destabilize the political relationship between the two sides, I think the Chinese leadership starts to think that nuclear weapons can play an important role in containing that political threat and in stabilizing the bilateral political relationship. I think this is a major difference because for a long time, people believed that China's nuclear weapons are there to achieve one goal only, which is to maintain a credible mutual nuclear deterrent relationship, right? To ensure that Chinese enemies wouldn't be able to threaten China with nuclear weapons. But now I think, given the political tensions, the political troubles, nuclear weapons are picking up a new role, which is to stabilize the political relationship. So when the mindset has evolved as such, apparently there is growing interest throughout the system to focus on building better and better nuclear technologies and greater arsenal. As China's arsenal grows, if China does not see the expected results of a more stable China-US or China-West relationship, I think the thinking would be, okay, we need actually more nuclear weapons. This will make the risk of nuclear arms race much greater than before. And when people are really concentrating on how to strengthen China's nuclear arsenal, of course, there will be less attention paid to the risks associated with such nuclear buildup. There has been a report that China is now increasingly interested in adopting postures such as launch under attack or even launch on warning. It may be shifting its practice from keeping its nuclear weapons at very low level during peacetime to putting a portion of its nuclear forces on higher alert level during peacetime on a rotational basis. China may change its traditional practice of separating warheads from missiles and storing them at different locations if China wants to move towards a launch under attack posture. There is a greater focus on the importance of theater range nuclear weapons, especially conventional nuclear dual-capable missile system like DF-26. If such dual-capable technologies are applied to future nuclear systems like nuclear delivery systems like, if such dual-capable technologies are applied to future delivery systems like hypersonic weapons, I think the risk of misunderstanding and misjudgment in the conventional conflict would be higher than before. But all these risks are not really thoroughly discussed because people's attention is on how to strengthen the nuclear arsenal. The recent P5 statement on nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, although a very helpful declaratory policy does not appear to have really influenced people's thinking and the practical nuclear operational strategy when it comes to policy making and policy implementation. So we are facing, a fundamental problem, which is the Western countries' basic efforts to uphold their universal values, like human rights or individual rights, political freedom, are viewed as by China as posing the gravest threat to China's core national interest, which is regime security and political security. And China thinks there are at least two reasons that China needs a greater arsenal to achieve greater political stability. One is that the structural change in the international balance of power. Right, Western countries they are indeed really fear. They really fear about China's capacity to challenge the Western countries' predominance in the international system. So they made up all the excuses on human rights in order to slow down China's growth, and therefore it doesn't make sense for China to try to talk with Western countries and address their concerns, because their concerns are made up. And also, secondly, there's a strong belief within the Chinese system that Western countries they are inherently hegemonic in their strategic culture. Right, and such inherent biases and hegemonic nature in their culture cannot be resolved. The only solution is for China to further shift the balance of power to China's favor, to the point that Western countries would finally acknowledge China's success and China's power. That's when Western countries would eventually respect China and try to listen to China and treat China equally and fairly. And this such thinking is taking place against the overall background that there is a major and a growing information gap between the two societies. There's a major perception gap between the two societies. One example, most recent example is, the majority of Chinese public, including the majority of Chinese experts, policy experts, they seem to genuinely believe that the US is running biolabs in Ukraine to conduct illegal research to develop biological weapons, right? And it's just one of many examples. There across the board on many basic factual issues, there is a fundamental information gap and a perception gap that influences not only the mindset of general public, but also the expert community, and therefore also influences the thinking of officials. So the thing is, we have to address this fundamental problem. And I think in this regard, we may need to look at the historical example of the Helsinki process. When the two blocs, they made efforts to set some basic principles of national behavior, right? They agree that they need to respect national sovereignty on one hand, but they also agreed that they also need to respect human rights, individual rights, etc. There is, some measures along this line that connects domestic politics with foreign policy, security policy is very necessary to address their fundamental political disagreement. They need to recognize the importance of civil society that can provide some basic internal checks and balances to domestic policy making. They need to recognize the importance of the free flow of information so that countries can deal with each other on some common understandings of basic facts. Right? So that's first point I want to make. Secondly, I think another major challenge for US-China arms control or disarmament cooperation is there is lack of technical capacity. Right? China, unlike US and Russia, has not extensively participated in bilateral or trilateral arms control negotiations, and therefore Chinese experts in general do not have the confidence that arms control can be feasible right? They do not appreciate the fact that in history, US and Soviet Union were able to overcome their distrust and achieve some useful arms control cooperation. In China, the suspicion is very strong that arms control is impossible to happen, it's too easy to cheat, verification cannot work, it's either too relaxed, so it won't be effective, or it is too stringent that it would be too intrusive and undermine China's legitimate national secrets. So we need to, over time, build Chinese understanding and technical capacity so that they would have confidence in starting thinking more seriously about arms control measures. At the same time, as I said, the changing geopolitical environment is making the experts less likely to keep in touch with each other across the borders. Right today, when the political tensions are high, many Chinese institutes are adopting tighter and stricter security rules, confidentiality rules, which makes experts less likely to even talk with their foreign counterparts through online virtual meetings. Right, they need a lengthy official approval process to meet with foreigners, experts, officials, diplomats, etc., which makes it much harder to address misunderstandings about each other's policies. So in addition to the economic or technological decoupling, there's also the expert community decoupling. During the Cold War, we had the US and Soviet experts, scientists able to talk with each other and build the so-called epistemic community that played a very important role in promoting arms control cooperation. But here today, we have a situation where the pre-existing epistemic community between the two societies is eroding and decoupling. So we have, I would argue, we have a situation that is even more worrisome than during the Cold War today. So here, I think U.S. and the EU, they can consider measures to reach out to China, because China is concerned about such exchanges. But given the importance of keeping communication, I think U.S. and European countries should be more proactive in reaching out to Chinese experts, in maintaining and even extending such exchanges at all levels possible. Last quick point. Here, I think some European countries can play a very particular role in facilitating substantive discussions. There are many concrete arms control proposals raised by think tank research institute experts that address some of the Chinese concerns. One of the concerns is, how do we deal with the capability asymmetry between China and the United States? How do we do arms control when the two countries have such a capability gap? But there are already concrete proposals out there that can mitigate such concerns. The thing is, no one is picking up these proposals and seriously examining their feasibility. So I think we need to have some operational level discussion between experts from these countries and have them jointly examine the technical and the policy feasibility of these models and proposals, so that they may be able to find out that in fact there are some useful models they can easily pick up and run with. And in this case, because of the contentious relations between US and China, some European countries may be in a better position to act as hosts or facilitators or organizers of such expert communications, joint studies, etc. These are small measures to make, to promote substantive cooperation. But given the political challenges and given the high stakes, I think even small measures may be, worth very serious efforts. The the stakes are too high to ignore such small measures. So I think I've been going on for too long. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tong Chiang. So thank you very much for your informative summary into China's perspective on the matter. I think it's clear that China's use of nuclear weapons has changed over time, especially as a political tool. Nuclear weapons are important, obviously, for to avoid global dominance, especially as China is on a path to huge economic growth. But as you mentioned, it's not fair that China's nuclear policies are demonized, and Western nations should also look themselves in a mirror. Misinformation and exchange of information is key, especially if we're to see global security. So thank you very much for that. I will pass on to Reese.
Thanks, Jack. And I'm now delighted to introduce our final speaker, Antara Singh. She is a fellow at the Strategic Studies Programme at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi, India. She is a graduate from Tsinghua University, School of Public Policy and Management, People's Republic of China, and has been a Chinese language fellow at National Central University, Taiwan. Her area of research includes China-India relations, China-India-US triangle, China in South Asia, Chinese foreign policy, China's domestic developments, among others. She has a list of publications in national and international journals, the latest being her research on China's approach to South Asia, published in the East Asian Policy Journal by the East Asian Institute, National University of Singapore. So over to you, Antara Singh.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen so that, okay, can you see my presentation? Can you see my presentation? Yeah.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me for this important discussion. It is indeed an honor for me to be a part of this distinguished panel, and it has been such a rich discussion so far, and I learned so much from the interventions made by my co-panelists. So before I start my presentation, I would like to provide a brief background of the present status of China-India relations, and then I'll move into the Cold War dynamics and the interactions between US, China, Russia, and India. Yeah, so as we are already aware, China-India relation is actually going through a very difficult phase. On June 15, 2020, a deadly border skirmish happened between Indian and Chinese troops in the Galwan Valley region in eastern Ladakh, which actually caused casualties on both sides for the first time in nearly 45 years. Since then, China-India have been locked in a dangerous military stalemate at the disputed border. After a major breakthrough in February 2021, when Chinese and Indian troops withdrew from the north and south banks of the Pangong Tso in Ladakh, the disengagement process has somehow lost momentum in the last few months. The military level talks have been happening at regular intervals, but they have not been able to achieve much yet. And the tension persists at various friction points, like in Gogra, in Hot Spring, in Depsang Plains, among others. if you look closely, you can see that it is not just a military stalemate, but also a political stalemate that has developed between the two countries. For instance, both sides are accusing each other of antagonistic policy changes that they have made against each other. For India, the present border crisis is an act of unprovoked Chinese aggression at the LAC, much in line with the recent episodes of China's power projection in the entire Indo-Pacific region. Indian strategists have mostly interpreted it as a fundamental consequential shift in China's behavior and a successful salami slicing maneuver. While the Chinese side believes that the present border crisis is the result of a shift in India's China policy under Prime Minister Modi, in recent past, particularly after the onset of the pandemic in early 2020, Chinese strategists have been consistently writing about the issue of a perceived shift in India's China policy, India's strategic adjustment of major power diplomacy vis-a-vis China and the United States, which is marked by antagonistic competition towards China across the realms of ideology, economy, as well as the border issue. In the Chinese assessment, the present border crisis is China's retaliation to what is perceived as a clear change in India's China policy. The ongoing crisis also lays bare the difference between China and India on the issue of clarification or delineation of the line of actual control. Regardless of political affiliation or attitude towards China, there is a near consensus in India that the best way to end the repeated standoffs at the LSE and mitigate the fluctuations in China-India relations by once and for all clarifying the location of the LSE. The Indian strategist, the Indian strategic community has sought to communicate with China to pressurize it to resume the process of clarifying the LSE, which has been stalled since 2002. It is widely understood in India that only a settlement will end the shadowboxing on the LSE, usher in permanent win-win solution, permanent win-win situation between the two countries, and pave the way for regional cooperation beneficial to Asia and to the world. However, China remains elusive on the issue of clarifying the LSE. The Chinese ambassador to India, Mr. Sun Weidong, he recently at a conference, he ruled out the possibility of initiating the clarification process on grounds that clarifying the LSE could create new disputes and further hamper the process of maintaining peace and tranquility in the border areas. Within Chinese strategic circles, I think the clarification of the LSE is actually a non-starter. Chinese reluctance to address the border row is often supported by the argument that differences between India and China at the bilateral, regional, or at the international level are not solely caused by the border dispute, but that both India and China consider themselves to be emerging powers, but at different stages. So as per the Chinese assessment, if China agrees to the settlement of the border dispute, China and India competition will still continue at various levels, only that China will have one less card against India. So the Chinese apprehension is that if the LSE is determined and the border is delineated, India will be able to solidify its dominance over South Asia and then concentrate its entire strategic focus and main resources on the Indian Ocean, preventing China from entering the Indian Ocean and controlling China's lifeline. The other major point of contradiction between New Delhi and Beijing is related to the position of the border dispute within the overall bilateral ties. Following the Galwan clash, India took a series of punitive measures against China beyond the realm of military by, say, banning popular Chinese apps, restricting Chinese investments, and most recently excluding Huawei from India's 5G trials. The goal was to convey to Beijing that peace and tranquility on the border is absolutely essential for good relations. Since last year, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has reiterated the Indian stance multiple times through various forums that the bottom line for China-India relation is clear, that peace and tranquility must prevail on the border if the progress that has been made in the last 3 decades doesn't get jeopardized. With the crisis at the LSE, it cannot be business as usual. One cannot have friction and bloodshed and intimidation at the border and talk about having good relationship in other domain. Even in the Munich Security Conference that was held, I think, last month, Minister Jaishankar once again reiterated India's position that the state of border will determine the state of relationship. However complex it is, however long it takes, however difficult it gets, India will not agree to any change in the status quo or any attempt to unilaterally change the line of actual control. China, on the other hand, is reluctant to place the border issue as a necessary precondition for the positive development of China-India relations. The Chinese side has conveyed at various instances that the border dispute should not assume the entirety of China-India relations. Instead, it should be put in a proper place in the overall bilateral ties, and that China and India should proceed towards developing enabling conditions for having better relationship or having greater practical cooperation between the two countries. So there is an overall understanding on either side that breaking this military political stalemate between China and India at the LSE is going to be a long-term, complicated and protracted process. Possibilities of any quick fix in the current international situation looks rather grim. As India's ties with China hit the rock bottom, there has been an unprecedented interest in Indian strategic circles to further deepen strategic ties, the strategic as well as defense and trade ties with like-minded countries, particularly the United States, and actively participate in the US Indo-Pacific strategy or the Quad. Accordingly, the India-US relations have made significant progress in the last few years, overcoming what they say the hesitancy of history and transforming itself into a truly global strategic partnership. Meanwhile, India has simultaneously maintained stable ties with Moscow. India's relation with Russia might not be having the warmth of, say, the past, but it still continues to remain very crucial to India's interest in a range of strategic areas. India's dependence on Russian weapons is well known. Energy cooperation, joint production, joint research and development, and technology transfer of weapons and equipment are important propellers for India-Russia relations. But the Ukraine conflict and the widening rift between Russia and the West has somewhat complicated the situation for India. Maintaining strategic autonomy, developing balanced ties with US, Europe, Russia, at the same time, practicing a multi-aligned foreign policy, which has marked India's diplomacy in the past few years, is increasingly becoming difficult in the current situation. There is increasing pressure over India to make difficult choices, to carry out various policy adjustments. New Delhi is also concerned that the conflict in Europe will distract the international community, further embolden Beijing to pursue high-handed policies in Asia. There is also growing concern in India about a possible Russia-China alliance. This sort of alliance is worrisome for India, not only because it is seen as, not in line with the rules-based global democratic order that is what India believes in, but also because, or primarily due to the potential impact of Russia joining with its two nuclear power neighbors, that is China and Pakistan, with whom it shares very complicated ties. And of course, which is expected to further deteriorate India's strategic environment. As a result, India has tried to maintain a neutral or balanced or equidistant stance in the Ukraine crisis. It has not publicly condemned Russia, but has continuously urged for peace. It had simultaneous interactions with both sides and even supplied humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Even as the Ukraine crisis has emerged as a challenge to Indian diplomacy, India continues to remain an important variable in US, Russia, and China strategic interactions. For instance, for US, given India's given India's geographic advantage, its military strength, its highly complicated ties with China, the US sees India as a critical strategic partner, a strategic asset in the Indo-Pacific region. American leaders have time and again talked about their strategic bet on India to ensure the security of the Indian Ocean region. The US Indo-Pacific strategy released last February further reiterated how it counts on India to be a net security provider, playing a leading role in maintaining Indian Ocean security. Given India's rising importance to US foreign policy, the US today is much more accepting or accommodating towards India with all its unique political realities, like its close ties with traditional US adversaries like Russia, like Iran, and the US side is also making efforts to swing India in a direction that is favorable to the US interest. Secondly, India has a unique role to play in Russia's global strategy amidst its increasing tension with the West on one hand and the fundamentally reversed Sino-Russian power balance on the other hand. Russia-India relations, good Russia-India relations help Russia to maintain its initiative in China-Russia relations, hedge against the various uncertainties in Russia-China relations, like Russian over-dependence on China. At the same time, it provides a unique opportunity or platform for Russia to reach out to the United States or to the Western countries, given the increasing strategic partnership or closeness between India and the US as well as the West. Thirdly, what is often overlooked or deliberately, if I may say, underplayed is India's important role in China's foreign policy. India being a non-ally of the United States and having a very rich tradition of non-alignment, China has long hoped for India's cooperation to hedge against the US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. Secondly, India remains at the core of China's Belt and Road Grand Strategy in South Asia, be it China's Western Development Strategy, its pursuit for common prosperity, or its Two Ocean Strategy. Close connection with India, both physically and economically, is of great importance to Chinese interests. It is no coincidence that all of China's high-profile mega connectivity initiatives in South Asia under the Belt and Road, like the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Economic Corridor, the China, Nepal, India Trans-Himalayan Corridor, the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, all of that, it actually encompasses India and Indian economy, either in its present form or as per the plans in the future. Even the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which India publicly opposes, would in the long term become China-Pakistan, India, Iran, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan corridor, which as per Chinese plans is going to open up South Asia and form a new trans-Himalayan economic growth zone for China. Overall, one can conclude that the the Ukraine crisis has indeed evolved as a major test for Indian foreign policy, with pressure mounting on various fronts. But overall, India's status as the most consequential global swing state with the potential to decisively tilt the Indo-Pacific balance of power in either direction still remains intact. Now, can India leverage this to its own interests, securing benefit from all directions while committing to none? Or will its non-aligned or multi-aligned foreign policy become the biggest hurdle in realization of its various geopolitical goals and ambitions? That is still quite unclear. That needs to be seen in the future. So I'll stop there, and we'll be happy to address any question or comments if you may have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Antara. That was a really fascinating and insightful presentation, and it was great to hear about the latest developments in the India-China relationship. It's very interesting to hear your point about India being possibly the most important geostrategic partner of the US, Russia, and China, which I think is probably overlooked often in the West. And also your argument about how the Ukraine the Ukraine conflict has complicated the situation for India, and it will now make it forces it to make some difficult decisions. So they're really interesting points, I think. So we now come to the Q&A section, and we have time for a few questions. Please do write your questions in the Q&A chat function box. So the first question we have is for Tong. It's from Anna, and the question is, you mentioned that due to the hegemonic influence of the West, the only solution is to shift the power to China's favor. How would you do this practically? So that's for Tong. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I want to clarify first. All what I said in my opening remarks are my efforts to describe the mainstream thinking in China. I am not saying that Western countries are demonizing China. I'm simply describing the Chinese perception. Right? So to answer your question, how to achieve it from the Chinese perspective. China understands that its previous economic success over the last few decades is very much a result of China being incorporated into the international economic system dominated by Western countries. China benefited tremendously from having this access to Western investments, technologies, and markets. So for China, the fundamental guarantee to be able, for China to be able to eventually become stronger in terms of material power than Western countries is to ensure China can maintain its economic growth at a higher rate than the Western countries. That's how you shift the, you gradually catch up and eventually exceed your rivals in this competition of development. So economic development is the fundamental guarantor for long-term, for out-competing the Western countries. If you have a good economic development, then you have resources to develop your military power and to invest in the state media that can enhance your, hopefully can enhance your soft power and your leverage to influence international public opinion and to shift international narratives, etc. So everything is based on your higher economic growth rates than your rivals. So for the foreseeable future, China understands its current power is still weaker than the Western countries. So it has to prioritize preserving its access to Western technologies and markets for the foreseeable future. However, that said, I think China increasingly believes that the Western countries, because of the two factors I said, one is the structural change in national balance of power, the Western countries are bound to become more desperate to prevent and slow down China's growth. And second, they believe the Western countries are inherently hegemonic and embrace inherent biases against the Chinese political model, etc. So eventually there will be a showdown of some sort between China and the West. So we have to prepare for that. This thinking, I think, is very much driving China's increasingly heavier investment into comprehensive military modernization, including nuclear buildup. So the hope is China can maintain its access to the Western markets and technologies for as long as possible. And China should use this time to strengthen its own capacity of self-reliance and autarky, right? This is a key argument repeatedly made by the current Chinese paramount leader. Right? China needs to make sure it won't have the so-called bottlenecks that can be easily strangled by Western countries. Right? In the current war in Ukraine, right, China is basically watching Western countries work together to strangle Russia through crippling economic sanctions, complete diplomatic and political isolation, etc. So this will further, I think, reinforce the Chinese belief that we need to use this time to grow and especially become more and more self-reliant in the most important economic and technological areas. So eventually, China would have the capacity to, not be independent from, reliance on the West. So I think that's the plan. But of course, there are internal tensions in this plan. Your growth requires interdependence, requires access, but your eventual goal is really to become independent and self-reliant. How your enemies will know your intent and they will hedge. So can China really achieve this? I think there are big uncertainties, but it's not surprising that in this system there may be significant internal incoherences in the strategic thinking. When you don't have debates, when you don't have public debates, you don't have people challenging the thinking of the top leadership. So I think that whether China can actually implement this plan successfully needs more time to be for us to understand.
Thank you, Tom. So next question is actually quite a positive one, which is weird because as a disarmament organization, our webinars are not usually flooded with positive questions. So this question is, will Putin's actions bring a new wave of global collectivism? All but 4 countries officially supported the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the United Nations General Assembly, these being Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, and Syria. India abstained. We have seen China call for negotiations for a ceasefire. Could this lead to a new era of upholding grand principles like the UN Charter and international law? And Tara, if you'd like to step in.
Yes,
I think the mainstream Chinese perspective is that the current international order was set up by the current dominating powers, i.e., the Western countries, and China believes that according to the track record of Western countries, they have always tried to manipulate the rules and norms and the order and to bend them, to change them, to maximize their own interests. Therefore, you have seen China always accusing Western countries of practicing double standards. So China was, I think is increasingly adopting a very cynical view about the current international order and the Western countries' compliance and implementation of the order that they themselves established. So that's why I think China doesn't, take a very categorical or absolute perspective on the UN Charter or the international order. It is viewed as manipulatable, and it's not set in stone. So we see, China, always defending UN Charter and countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. But when it came to the Ukraine and other issues, China wouldn't call it invasion, wouldn't call it a violation of UN Charter, wouldn't call the invasion an invasion. So I think that reflects this very cynical view about the nature of the current international order. So I think the mainstream view is China needs to work with like-minded countries to gradually influence the international order so that Western countries would have less a say in how a new order should be constructed, or what new adjustment should be applied to the existing order. So I do think the competition over the future shape of international order is going to be increasingly intense between China and many of the Western countries.
If I may just intervene, about India's position on the Ukraine crisis. I think, as I narrated in my presentation, India has its compulsions, various compulsions to, to act in a way that it is doing. It has, it has tried its best to balance the situation. But then, you also have to see the kind of situation India is facing. It is facing two nuclear armed neighbors with whom it has very, very complicated relationship. As I narrated in my presentation, that it is still in the middle of a border standoff, which can go in any direction. So India's reaction, you have to see India's reaction in the right perspective. And, if you see how India has tried to balance its reaction to the Ukraine crisis, you will see that it has reached out to both the sides. It is, yes, it has not condemned Russia, but then it is also, it has also sent humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So at certain level, it has tried to balance it out between both the parties. And that is actually coming from the compulsions that it has, and the kind of dependence that it has on Russia, and the kind of arms dependence that it has on Russia. So I think India's position needs to be taken into the right context.
Thank you for that. And we actually do have one final question, which is also for Antara, which is, where does India fit into the discussion around arms control and disarmament, and what role could India play in the future in terms of advancing the cause of non-proliferation and disarmament in general?
Yes, I think India has always tried to play a responsible player in this domain. In the say within the limits that that permits it in the present international situation, or in its what is permissible to it in its present strategic neighborhood. So I would just like to say that, you know, India's understanding, it has always tried to be a responsible power, but then the situation in the subcontinent needs to be taken into account while you know, discussing India's role in disarmament.
Thank you for your reply there. Well, that concludes the Q&A and brings us to the end of the webinar and indeed the series. We'd like to thank our audience for their questions and for attending, and we offer special thanks to all of our panelists across the whole series for their thought-provoking and insightful presentations. I will now pass over to Jack for a few final words.
Yep, so you can stay up to date with our work and join our newsletter by writing to scrap.weapons@soas.ac.uk and follow Scrap Weapons on social media. A video recording of this webinar will soon be available on Scrap Weapons YouTube channel. Thank you all for coming, and have a good day, everyone.